Good evening, TNT family. Welcome back to Yellow is the Code program on UNC USA. And tonight the discussion is more in the direction of community resilience and how we can go about planning ourselves and organizing ourselves for whether it's disaster response, medical emergency, or even dealing with a crime situation. And we have with us here our former CEO of the ODPM, Dr. Stephen Ramrup. And Dr. Ramrup, I just want to welcome you thank you for taking the time to explain and break these things down so that you could help our community understand how we can go about doing things. So, welcome to Yellow is the Code on UNC USA.
Hi. Good evening. Can you hear me? Right? You're hearing us.
Yeah, I'm here really good and clear. Yeah.
Great. Good. Okay. Hmm, the the thing is that we have a very small country. A number of persons who might be listening on this evening's program and on many of the programs would be probably living in countries that are 20, 30, 40 times the size of Trinidad or even more. With such a small country, 1.3 to 1.5 million persons living in such a small area, that having a very comprehensive analysis of our population, their vulnerabilities, their needs, um, and what we can do to reduce some of the problems that we are having within our society. It is not impossible, because in some of the developed countries or developing countries, we have programs that have been implemented that have worked, and we can use some of those solutions, not just lock, stock, and barrel. We have to adapt it to our situation, our culture, um, but it is possible. So at the outset, I would like to say that it is possible. Um, we Some of us who have worked in communities, I mean, I do work with Rotary International in many communities in Trinidad. We have been a Rotarian now for over 40 years, and we have been working with indigent persons who living in our communities in Trinidad. I mean, I've been to India and assisted many communities. In fact, assist some of the Indian Rotarians and the government and other stakeholders in eradicating polio in India. This is a marvelous feat, because India was one of the countries where polio was a big problem. And when we looked at some of the clinics and we saw some of the persons who were affected by polio, it was amazing to see the results that we obtained by implementing programs within those communities in terms of immunization and education surrounding the immunization campaign. So it is something that I know that could be done. What I'm about to say, or what I'm about to express, is not my are not my views, in the sense that my observations, but they are based on scientific information, data that are obtained from studies, and that have been done by many organizations in the world, in particular organizations like the IFRC, or Red Cross, organizations such as UNDP, where in many countries assessments are done, community assessments. And basically, most of our workers in emergency, disaster risk reduction, social development, economics, infrastructure development, healthcare, mental health, we have found that many communities differ. In fact, some communities are not the same as other communities, although they might be adjacent or very close to each other, because of the type of risks that they face. So when one talks about a community, we first of all have to define exactly what we mean. And that has been a very difficult thing for many persons, in defining exactly what a community means. To many, a community means a village, a group of persons who have some common interests, a common location, either geographical or economical, squatters in a particular area, for example, or in unregulated settlements. Um, we have persons, for example, who might be professionals, academics, retired principals, retired police officers. We have persons, for example, who might be in sports groups, or persons who might be involved in social work or humanitarian work. So there are many organizations, associations, non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, community-based organizations that work within many of our jurisdictions. So a community is basically really a group of persons who have similar interests, ideals, and share commonalities. And therefore, to build resilience, and what exactly is resilience, right, within communities means that it's a whole approach. It's not just saying that I want to make sure that they're safe from disasters, but we have to understand what resilience is, and that in itself is very difficult to define. If you look at if you Google resilience on any one of the search engines, you'll see thousands of definitions for resilience. But the one that works most is that, and I mean, I've always remembered this as a young man growing up, and people talking about resilience in some of our workshops in medicine or in disaster management, or as late as forensic sciences. And they would tell you that resilience is like a young bamboo. And if you bend that bamboo, no matter how you bend it, it doesn't break. It's very difficult to break it. So resilience of a community is the ability to bend that community, bend it in such a way, affect it in such a way, damage it in such a way, destroy it in such a way that you bend it so badly. And when you bend it, they actually straighten back up again and they survive that bend. And what does that tell us? What does that mean? It means that no matter what you do, you can't remove things like flooding. You have to understand that. You can't remove negative people or evil people from the world, because it's a it's a difficult thing, because we are who we are. In any community, you will have good and you will have evil or bad. And therefore, from the dawn of man, from the first instances where man, they say that we used to be in caves and roaming and hunting for food. We fought with each other, right? Because people invaded other persons who had more food, and who had better people, or more skills and more tools, and that has been going on since time immemorial. So we can't remove, and this is very difficult to say, but we can't remove all the evil from the world. um, so what we have to do, therefore, is we have to cope with it, and we have to, like the bamboo, we have to be able to bend in such a way that we can protect our children, protect our communities from that impact, that hazard, that thing that causes us to bend and break. See, so we must be able to look at some of the historical, some of our history, our historical past, where we see communities that were destroyed by earthquakes, by hurricanes, by volcanic eruptions in the past. There are civilizations that were wiped out: the Aztecs, the Mayans. And when we look at all of those civilizations in the past, the Greek civilizations, the Roman civilizations, the Persian civilizations, the Indus civilizations, you would find that civilizations grow, they peak, and then they are destroyed. And then it is a cycle that repeats itself. So that when we look at our small little Trinidad and Tobago, we have to realize that, firstly, if you recap a bit, that we can improve it. Two, that we cannot not be exposed to hazards. We will be exposed to climate change. Climate change is a global phenomenon. It has been caused by large countries pushing quite a lot of junk into the air. Um, these emissions have caused quite a lot of destruction to the ozone layer, right? The oceans have been warming up more than they should. This is putting increased problems on the climate, right? And the type of water that you're seeing now rising is because of the ice melting again due to the warming up of the climate. This increase in ice caps melting both in the north and south causes increased water, and sea level is rising. If any of you all have been to Trinidad and you went down to Los Hero, Icacos, Citrus, right? You have been there for the past 5, 10, 15 years, and you go now, you will see that the map is not the same map that we used to draw in geography when we were in secondary school in Trinidad and Tobago. If you're a baby boomer like me, it means that you would actually have seen some of this impact. If you take a helicopter or a small aircraft and you're flying from Tobago to Trinidad and you look at the east coastline, you see the evidence of this erosion and this water level rise. So it means that if you look at some of the countries in the Pacific, some of the countries in around the east, south of Japan, south of China, many of those countries in the Pacific Islands, some of them are going to be underwater very soon. So this is a real problem, especially to the Caribbean islands and especially to Trinidad and Tobago. It's called a small island development state. So many of us who have been to climate change conferences, we have been to disaster risk reduction workshops and seminars. We have represented our government at many fora, right? And we have sat with many of the technocrats, the experts, the scientists. We have looked at studies from the databases of disaster risk reduction and climate change, and we know and we can actually forecast many of the risks that will affect our small country as we going forward. So scientifically, it is how we do things, and I mean, if you go back to, for example, if you go back to your schooling, many of us would remember that we went to elementary school and they will go carry us outside one day and say, okay, let's do two timetables and three timetables, and they will have us one time two is two, two times two is four, three times two is six, and we do that like we didn't even know what we were saying. We just know we had to sing it, right? And then we started with A, B, C, D, E, and we had to learn from A to Z. We didn't know what it was those letters was going to do for us, but we had to learn A to Z. Now, all of that was developing the human mind, developing the human intellect, because later on we would be able to form words. Then look at us now speaking and typing on our phones. Um, some of us can now talk on the phone, and the phone will actually form the words ourselves. Look at how we have come so far from learning the times tables, because now the computer does that for you as well. The point that I'm making is that you go into school and you learn things, form one, form two, form three, form four, form five, and you learn things. And it's only later on in life you actually see how these things evolve and how they make sense. How V equal IR, we used to do that in maths and switch around the thing. What make R the subject of the formula, make I the subject of the formula, and it's only when we started doing physics later on we realized that voltage, current, and resistance is what that really meant. And if you can measure current by looking at the resistance in the wire and the voltage on the two ends of the wire. So what I'm saying is that there is science in what I am saying now. It is not conjecture. It is not something that I invented. It is something that is going on in many communities because of, as I said, what is happening with climate change in some of the islands in the Pacific, which is actually underwater now. It happened in the old, when we looked at some of the archaeological finds and some of the digs, when we looked at the Egyptian ruins, when we look at some of the Mayan ruins, when we look at the Aztecs and the population, the civilizations of the past, we realize that there are things that happened. We saw massive catastrophic events such as volcanic eruptions and earthquakes that decimated many of those civilizations. We in our small country, we are prone to some hazards, and those hazards are hurricanes. And although we always thought that we were very low down, you can see because of the same climate change that the hurricanes are actually coming lower and lower. We are prone to earthquakes. Many of you all might have remembered that there was a volcanic eruption in Kikemjeni, just off the coast of Grenada, and this affected some of the cables that were bringing in the actual internet service to Trinidad and Tobago. And for a while, we had a problem because one of the cables were affected by the volcanic eruption, and then we had a big problem with some of our internet providers in terms of flow and some of the other providers in Trinidad just because of that eruption. It hasn't changed. The volcano is still there, and those cables are still there. So one of the things that you have to understand is that there will be a time, if I mean, hopefully it doesn't happen in the lifetime of some of us here, but we have to always remember that we have to plan for the future, and we don't want our children to be exposed to some of the things that we can probably change now. One of the other problems that we have is that when we live very close to a continent, such as the South American continent, and many of you all know that we can actually see Venezuela, you have to understand that the world, right, the movement of people started in the days of the Bering Strait, when in the northern part of this globe, this world, people crossed that strait from the east and moved across from Central Asia, Central Europe, and moved across the continent and came down the North American continent right down into South America. Many of you all remember the Caribs and the Arawaks from the Caribbean, and especially in Trinidad and Tobago, and we still have some remnants of the Caribs in Trinidad and Tobago. Most of these people have gone now, and the next couple generations, they probably wouldn't exist. The reason why I'm talking about this is because of our because of the ancestries, because of this whole movement of people. You cannot stop people from moving. We created artificial boundaries, right, that separated countries. For example, North America has a imaginary line between Canada and United States. United States has an imaginary line between U.S. and Mexico, etc., etc. But people move, and this is one of the big problems that the POTUS is having right now in the United States because of the movement of people. We had massive movements of people in Europe, and how could we as a country know that we are so close to Venezuela, and with all the disturbances that we are having, that we would not have the movement of people either legally or illegally from that country? So do you think it will stop? If you go back in history, you'll realize that there were times in Trinidad where Port of Spain, and many of you would read some of the old books or some of the old newspapers, where in Port of Spain you would have Venezuelans who would be coming to Port of Spain and then going back on the boats, and Trinidadians do the same thing when they go to La Guaira in Venezuela. And if you go to that village in La Guaira, you will see Trinidadians there. They live on the streets and they're selling doubles. So the proximity means that you would have had a run in the country. And therefore, it is sad that some of the government of the day, right, did not understand that and did not put things in place to deal with it. So now we have to deal with it because the Venezuelans are here. We had a movement of Cubans before the Venezuelans. And when that eased up a bit, then the Venezuelans came. So again, migration, new populations would have problems. Right now, we have big problems because when the Venezuelans came into some of our communities, they were working for cheap. They're working cheaper. So that when we used to have somebody to come and cut the grass in our property or clean the hedges or pick our fruits, we can't get the Trinidadians to do that because they're not available. The Venezuelans are doing it. The Trinidadians were not doing it because we couldn't pay them. Their fees were like $300 a day to do something, whereas you can give a Venny maybe $100 or even less, to work for 2 or 3 hours and clean up your property, when you have to pay a Trinidadian $300 to $400. As more and more skilled persons came in, you find that they were competing for the jobs. Right? One of the problems that we have again with the Venezuelans is that most of them who would come will come and they will either get pregnant before they come or come with little children. And many are begging because they use the children, as in India. If you go to India, you will see that a lot, where they use the children to assist them to get money by begging. Now, many of these children, imagine this, the government would not have provided or are not providing schooling for these children. So basically, in 5 to 10 years' time, when these 5-year-olds become teenagers, it means that they will not have a school, right? They are not being homeschooled, right? The parents are busy trying to make money at their home. And what will that happen? Again, more population and more crime because they will sort to stealing. And it's just a statistical probability that is very high. So it's not something that we should uh, put aside lightly. It's a big threat to our social fabric as Trinidadians and Tobagonians, having to deal with, again, our history in terms of the East Indians, in terms of slavery, right, in terms of our mixed populations, right? We now have to deal with the Venezuelans, and it is something that a clear national policy has to be developed when you start talking about community resilience. We now talked about crime because when you are so close again to to the South American continent, you would have movement of people, and once you have movement of people, you would have very bad people who would get involved with that. And once you have bad people involved, they would start to move illegal drugs, and once they start moving illegal drugs, they will move humans for human trafficking, and then once you begin to move humans and you bring them in illegally and they have no employment because we have a problem for employment now, it means that some will be forced to be enter into prostitution. So one of the most one of the most what we should say the oldest profession in our world, and it is quite a money spinner for some of the persons who are involved in it. And this is a big problem in our country. So once you have illegal drugs, human trafficking, right, you will get more murders, you will get homicides. And once you have homicides, again, you have problems in the community. People start to be exposed to the criminal elements, right? And therefore, that's another big problem affecting our society. So let's come back now to, we have explained some of the risks, right? We have explained some of the hazards that we face as communities in Trinidad and Tobago. And therefore, we now can now understand, we sort of talked about resilience and what resilience means in terms of the bamboo not being able to break, right? But you could bend it, so you stress us, but we are going to cope somehow and survive. And this is what we have to understand that we have to do now with our communities. We have a big problem with crime. We know that, right? We see kidnappings on a daily basis. We see young children who are missing, and then we find them in shallow graves. We find persons just recently, I think it was up to yesterday, a guy who was chopped up in Penal and he was bound and chopped, right? So they're still trying to identify who it is. So we have some very gruesome crimes that have been committed. This affects the psyche of even young children, right? And when young children growing up at a very sensitive age, like especially, I mean, look at the common entrance, the most successful child in common entrance, and she says that she hopes that they eliminate the common entrance. So there are other stresses, right, in terms of communities, and this has a very serious impact on mental health, and this mental health issue is a very big thing going forward, especially after we were affected by COVID 19. People probably start forgetting about it, but it was a very stressful time for many persons, and children many children grew up, right, in homes for almost a year to 2 years without having exposure to other children and just within their own homes, and that would have affected them to a large extent. So we still going to have to figure out what happened, what is going to happen again with this post-COVID. It's not over yet, and we're still having COVID cases, but we still have to see some of the problems with the post-COVID era and how it affected populations, how it affected children, and what these statistics going to show in the next 5 to 10 years. It'll be very interesting. So community resilience is really the community's capacity. The capacity is the ability of that community as a whole, or even in terms of one or two persons, leaders, groups within the community, but the whole community as a whole, the capacity to recover from any adverse situation, such as we talked about a natural disaster, man-made disaster, economic crises, crime, social disruptions, etc. And it allows for the ability to prepare for, withstand, and adapt to the challenges. Adaptation is another word that we have to understand. Since we can't prevent the floods, since we can't prevent the hurricanes, and we cannot prevent the earthquakes, it means that we would have to adapt to it, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. And if you were to think about what happens when a mother has a child and the environment is dangerous, what does the mother do? She protects the child. You see it in the animal kingdom, and you see it in the human species, where the mother will cuddle the child and curve over the child and shelter the child. So what is one of the first things that a person or a human being or animal will do when there is a impact, there is a hazard, there is a threat to the life or limb of that individual or organism? They try to shelter that organism. They shelter the vulnerable organism, which is like the child. So when you have a hurricane or earthquake, what's the first thing that you do to protect your family, to protect your children, to protect your neighbors, to protect a community, protect a nation, is that you have to have a good shelter. You have to provide shelter, even before water, because the mother don't give the child water, right? When somebody has a gun or somebody has a cutlass or somebody's coming to them, they protect them by cuddling them and covering them, and they provide that shelter. And that's important, all right, because shelter is one of the first important things that you have to have when you have a disaster, right? Um, the other thing will come after, and that is once you are able to provide a good shelter, you would have to get water, because the human being needs water. You need potable water, right? After water, you have to look at security, especially with the crimes. Now, if you have communities that are close to Port of Spain, you have communities that have already criminals who are robbing people, burglarizing homes, stealing your fruits, right? Coming into your properties and bullying people in the older persons in the village or children at school. And you have this community that is there in a disaster. Do you think that those people would suddenly become humane and empathic? Do you think that they will suddenly change? No, the answer is no. So, in other words, then even if your community is a high risk community for crimes or criminal elements, and you are impacted by a disaster, you have to also now have a security component in those communities. And that is where it starts again, right, with the community being able to be resilient, protect themselves, learn to protect themselves, learn to identify the risks. But also, here's where the government of the day would have to have steps that are taken to protect those vulnerable communities when they are most vulnerable, especially in a disaster, knowing that there are criminal elements that existed there before, right? So their homes, their properties, their children, right? They can be assaulted, right? In shelters, in the shelters that are provided by government, especially where you have more people, right? Where you can have exposure, right? Sexual assault of some of our children, all right? And they have had it before in other shelters around the world in disasters. So we have to learn from all of those things. So what I'm saying is that once you have existing crime, you have to also now have a different program, right, in those areas. I mean, if you go to a village in Canada where you never had a murder, you didn't have a problem with burglary or pre-deal larceny, and you have a disaster, right, the crime might be a low element. You might be more prone to be a little more, flexible with children going to the bathroom in a shelter, but not in some of our areas in Trinidad and therefore and Tobago, and therefore you have to now factor that into your community resilience toolkit, which I'll talk about in a short while. So um, basically, when you look at all of those things, you have to understand that there is a way to improve and to reduce the impact, right, of any hazard in a community. And how do we do that? What are some of the things that can be done to develop this resiliency, to make us become like the little young bamboo, make us bend but not break? And a lot of that has to do with, if we were to take one of the first things, right, which we noticed in some of the disasters, for example, in New Zealand, when they had the big disaster, the earthquake, right? What they did is when they look at studies after, like in Christchurch, and when we looked at what the damage that was done, and we looked at other populations around the world post earthquake, like in Japan, post earthquake, like in Haiti, we found that a lesser severe earthquake in Haiti killed more people than a more severe earthquake in Japan because of the ability of the community to be prepared for that disaster. So I'll say it again. More people died in Haiti because they were not as prepared, and they had a less severe earthquake than an earthquake in Japan, which was more severe. Less people died because they were more prepared in Japan, and the communities were more prepared. The government was prepared, and the community was prepared. See, when an earthquake strikes, the disaster that we look at most, or what we call a hazard, is the earthquake, because the earthquake can happen anytime and you don't know it's coming. You'll be given just a short few seconds of warning and then the earthquake strikes. If you live in a house that is not built properly, the earthquake didn't kill you or damage you or your children. It is the house that you have or you're living in that is what kills you or makes you or gets you injured. And you can say it's the earthquake that caused it, but really and truly it's a house. And if you have a properly built home, which is structurally able to withstand an earthquake, again, you can survive the earthquake, and you will not get injured or sustain death in the family or loss in the family. So one of the things, obviously, is infrastructural resilience, meaning that the community has to be able to understand that if you're living next to a river and that river always floods, whether you like it or not, a river floods. It is what happens with rivers. Rivers, if we remember from geography, right, you have an upper course, middle course, and lower course. And these three courses, they flood at each one of these courses. It is how a river develops over time. By flooding, it actually, in the floodplains, right, it's what a river does. It's the work of a river. And many of the features that we studied in geography, right, due to flooding, were created by water and how water formed estuaries and deltas. Yes, because of the silting and the collection of material from higher up, and it brings it down in the lower courses of the river, and it stagnates, it creates deltas, and this is fertile. This is how the Nile Delta was created, the Mississippi Delta, all of these large big rivers, the Amazon, the Orinoco. This is how Trinidad was formed in our history. We were part of that whole delta, and that is how we have the three peaks, the northern range, the central range, and the southern range. three big peaks of the Andes, and then all of a sudden, in the middle, you have all the silt and sand and old vegetation and everything compressed for years. That's how we got the oil, and that's how we talked about yesterday, the sapate mud, which moves under us. And that is why from San Fernando to Mayaro, when I'm driving, I have to be almost like I'm in a roller coaster because of the way that the sapate mud moves. And no matter what you put on top, it's going to move unless we build bridges. So we keep on fixing roads in some of our areas, but hopefully one day somebody will realize that it might be better to just build a bridge over the whole thing. Use the more stronger points and build a bridge rather than to keep spending money year after year just fixing the roads. So these are some of the things that really and truly we'd have to sit down and look at the communities, identify the risks, look at the engineering possibilities, and then start building our communities in a way that is better. Build your communities better. And it's not going to ever be perfect because life continues to change. What happened 10, 15 years ago in a community is not going to be what happens now. Children are changing. They are exposed to the fourth industrial age. They're playing with iPhones and iPads and tablets, and they're exposed to the media and to Instagram and TikTok and all of these social media. They're exposed to it. So the whole environment has changed. Their whole psyche has changed. Their interests have changed. The risks have changed. We have now cyberbullying, um, in addition to bullying at the schools physically. So all of these can affect the mental health of children within our communities. Good. People are afraid to come out in the night because they're afraid their children get kidnapped or assaulted. All right. People are afraid to plant produce in their land because they lose it. In the morning when they come, all their zabukas and the avocado and the plantains and the plums and the mangoes, they're gone. Right. A lot of the persons who are selling mangoes and fruits in the towns and some of the roadways, some of them is not even theirs. That's what they get it from, their overnight excursions into other people's lands. So people are afraid, and all of these are some of the things that we are exposed to in our communities. So there's something called the Community Resilience Toolkit. And when we talked yesterday and a couple of days about crime, many people have solutions. They are experts in crime and fighting crime. Of course, they are experts in everything. And if you Google, you can get a lot of information as well. But there are certain things that you have to build. And yesterday, one of our colleagues on the program was talking about building the basics. And yes, you have to build the basics. If you remember the story about the three pigs and the wolf, you'll realize that the house that was built of straw got blown down pretty quickly. The house that was built with wood took a little while, but it did get blown down. But the house that was built with bricks, right, withstood the blowing by the wolf, and it didn't get blown away. So in order to protect our young, protect our family, protect our loved ones and our neighbors, our communities, we have to have infrastructure that is adapted to the risks that we face. If you're living next to a river, you will have flood. So if you're going to have flood, you don't build a flat house. If you're planting your fruits and vegetables next to a river, the fruit will grow beautifully because the soil is fertile. But history will tell you the Nile flooded, the Mississippi flooded, the Amazon floods, and it wipes out all your crops. And how can you forecast? And I use the word forecast because I'm not using the word predict. See, a prediction is something that when you go to the carnivals and you have these people with these crystal balls, right, and they can predict your future. That is not science, right? Science is more the ability to use data and models to get this analysis, and it is more of a forecast right? In other words, then they can see what is the most probable event that will occur based on the data and the information that we have at our hand at this point in time. So we don't predict an earthquake, we forecast the earthquake, we forecast the hazard, right, based on the information. So when the Met Office forecasts bad weather, they don't predict bad weather. So we have to be very careful with what we are saying, right, in terms of the words that we use. The other thing is disaster. Then you say, oh my God, there's a disaster. We have a disaster. What might be a disaster for a house is not a disaster for the village. A disaster is something that overwhelms the ability, right, of the individual or individuals to cope with that hazard. The hazard is what hits you. The earthquake is a hazard. The earthquake is not a disaster. The earthquake, if it occurs in the middle of the ocean and there are no ships, there are no land around, no matter how severe the earthquake is, it is not going to affect anybody. The tsunami just goes off because if in the middle of the ocean, it affects no one. Then it's not a disaster, it's just a hazard. The earthquake, on the other hand, is a hazard when it affects a city or a town or a village. It can create massive, massive disruption of society, right? Then, if the society is able to get up out of the rubble, survive the ordeal, and 80% of their population is survived the ordeal and they can build back their population in about 5 to 10 years, right? Then that that is resilience. If that earthquake overwhelms the capacity of the country, the village, the house to actually deal with the hazard impact, then it's a disaster. A disaster for the house in the first instance. If it extends to the village and the village can't take care of the village, then it is a disaster for the village. If the municipality cannot take care of the municipality, the regional area that it has to take care of, let's say Pinal Debe, and the resources that Pinal Debe is not able to take care of the disaster, right, that has occurred because it's overwhelmed the ability for it to cope, then it's a disaster for Pinal Debe, but not a disaster for the country, because you have other regional corporations that could come together and assist Pinal Debe. So you have to be careful when we talk about a national disaster, municipal disaster, village disaster, disaster in a house, etc. And that is where we have to be very careful, right? So when we start talking about community resilience, we have to start understanding the terminology and some of the things that we say. We have to be careful, because if we're not careful with the words that we use and the language that we use, then sometimes we get into a model, and um, then the science is all gone, and then we begin to talk like somebody, in the marketplace, where we talk, some commerce or move along, as we say, not science, and we don't want to do that. We want to keep it right into programs that have been done in other countries, that have been done in Trinidad, and that has worked, and that we can implement it. So, being such a small country, as we said, what are some of the things that we can do in our communities, right? We have already seen that during elections, for example, during the general elections or local government elections, certain persons like street captains or party groups would go down to all the villages and towns and cities. They know every street, they know where everybody resides on those streets. They knock on each one of the doors. And they do that every time the time comes around. Some people have a list and they will know that, hey, Stephen Ramrock lives here. He's there with his wife and his children, and they have a household that has 5 persons living in that house. Yes. So we have what is called a housing census, right? And that has been done, I think the last one that has been done in this country, somewhere like 2011, I think, if I remember correctly. I don't know if another one was done after, but the only one that I have in my hand right now is the 2011 housing census. The thing is that there must be the government of Trinidad and Tobago in this regime, in order to reduce crime, we need to locate every single person in our country, Venezuelans included. In other words, then, we have the Ministry of Planning and Development. They have a system. We have about 2,834 what we call enumeration districts, EDs for short, not electoral districts. EDs are called enumeration districts, and these are geographical areas that allow the persons who are doing the census, right? The census takers, or the persons who we hire to go out and do the interviews on the homes, to do about 200 persons in each one of those geographical areas and zones. So we have about four, we divide the country into 4 to 6 zones. We have about just under 3,000 of these enumeration districts, and each one of the EDs, right, the census taker will go to these districts, and they would have about 200 households. Some of the households might have 1 person, 2 persons, 5 persons, 10 persons, 15 persons, depending on what if it's a rental community. So by using the ED system, right, each municipality, each one of the regional corporations, they have a fixed number of EDs within that corporation. And using the municipalities, the 14 municipalities in Trinidad and Tobago, we can actually have persons who are able to go. And I'm saying that with the crime situation, certain communities will need police officers and police patrols to be with them when they're going to these homes. It will have to be obviously done via a process that normally is advertised and people are aware that the people are coming. They will have to do it in times when you could probably get most of the people who are at home, right? And in so doing, as I said, such a small country, it's not impossible to map every single house and dwelling, and it has been done. I have actually documents where I have, and you can actually get it from the Ministry of Planning and Administration. You can ask them for the last housing census, and in that, you'll go to the EDs for 200 dwellings or 200 households in each one of those. It tells you how many males, how many females, how many persons over a certain age of 60, 65. It tells you how many children. It tells you how many persons residing. It tells you about the house itself, whether it's wooden, whether it's concrete. You see, whether it's a dwelling that is a business dwelling. Now, what happens with this, with the tool, the community resilience toolkit, is that you are able now to add certain things, certain elements, or certain data fields in that, so that nowadays, with the use of the phone, the smartphone, we have apps that are created which are very helpful, and that these apps can, once you click on the app, you have, for example, the coordinates, the geographical coordinates, right, of the house, the dwelling. You have a photo that can be uploaded immediately. And then when you're taking the information on the phone and you click, you'll have the fields which will allow you to enter the males, the females, how many children, what are their ages, date of births, right, dates of birth, sorry, etc. So in other words, then there are a number of things that can be added at the field level of education, right? How many persons are working, how many persons are unemployed, how many, and this is where now you can have in some of our high risk communities, some of our squatting or unregulated settlements, you can find persons, how many persons have been vaccinated, how many persons are actually living at home, etc. Single mothers, single parents, pregnant mothers, persons with more than 2 or 3 children, persons who are disabled, etc., etc., etc. So I won't go into all the fields, but once you click on those and you set, it actually uploads right away to a central database. If you use the appropriate tools and it is actually managed properly at a central government and local government level, it means that the ability to use the smartphone, right, or even a pad, a tablet, right, in certain cases where we hope the police would be able to use that, the information can be shared with the police as well. So here's where now even the police can be able to determine from that information in certain communities how many persons actually living on that street or supposed to be living in that street, how many people are going to school and how many people are not in school, how many people are at their level of income, etc., etc., etc. So if one of the first things that I think that the government has to do to reduce some of the hazard impact or to mitigate the hazard impact. Mitigation is a very important word as well. What it means is that you know that you're going to get an impact, but in order for it to be less severe, you try to reduce the severity of the impact. And I said, I started by saying there are certain hazards that you just cannot remove, right? And I talked about good and bad. I remember one of the things that we were told to understand this good and bad thing in a more scientific way is that you have a battery, and a battery has a negative and positive pole. If you don't have a negative and a positive, there's no battery. So, unfortunately, I mean, although we have very high hopes for peace in this world, once you have human beings and we have different environmental conditions of life, and you have different genetics, and you have different exposure and stress. I mean, just last night I attended a Rotary meeting, and the topic that we had was from a pediatrician who was a neonatologist and who talked about the childhood stresses and how autism, obesity, and anxiety are some one of the three main factors which affects children, right, in their homes, and how they grow up and become adults. And that is a very essential lesson that we were reminded of last night in that Rotary meeting. And it is a real thing. And this is why embedded into the questionnaire and into the survey of the census taker, well, I'm hoping that we understand that it would not be just the census taker, but it will be social services, right, would be driving this with the census taker. We would have other persons who would be trained before they go into the community and how to do. In doing interviews is a skill. You have to be trained. Sometimes you have to have over 6 lessons, right, where you sit down and learn how to interview people, how to assess the environment. What you're looking for is, as we talked about, a house in an earthquake. Remember, you have a flat house next to a river. You have gardens where you have a fresh produce, right, and you're growing crops, right, next to a river. You have a house, right, where you you have had replacement of a roof before. You have no hurricane straps in that roof. Galvanized sheets are loose. Gutterings are clogged or no gutterings. Drainage from the house are non-existent or clogged with garbage or refuse. So all of these things are things that when you go into the home, these are some of the criteria or some of the fields that are filled out, in your assessment. So it cannot be just one person. It'll be have a team who will be assessing each one of those dwellings or homes. And this can be done in Trinidad and Tobago. As I told you, we're a small country. So if we begin in every single municipality, the 14 municipalities, if the government supports the Ministry of Social Services, the Ministry of Community Development, the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development, of course, the Ministry of National Security has to be involved in providing safety for the census takers, as well as the other persons who will be doing the assessment, what is called the risk assessment. We call it a vulnerability capacity assessment, because what it is that risk, if we are to use a simple equation, for those of you all who might understand the little mathematical or arithmetic, is that on the left side of the equation, you have risk. And risk is equal to 1, hazard. We talked about the different types of hazard. We talked about the growing hazards of migration from Venezuela, right, and the bringing in of human trafficking, prostitution, illegal drugs, right, crime, because we're not schooling the young children. We talked about that as a very important element. We talked about, sorry, something. Yeah. Okay. So we talked about the natural hazards such as weather changes, heavy winds, climate changes. We talked about flooding, which is what the South Americans tend to call, and Central Americans tend to call, a socio-natural hazard, meaning flooding is not just a natural hazard, right, which is due to riverine flooding or excessive water in falling on the land right now because of climate change, but also due to poor infrastructure. This is where you talked about drainage, poor homes, very bad policies of burning our hillsides during the crop time, right? Not taking proper care in terms of zoning, where we plant our crops and where we put our homes, infrastructure, the type of dwellings and the type of infrastructure that we build in areas prone to flooding, etc., etc. So it's a socio-natural hazard, flooding. Other natural hazards are earthquakes. We are very prone to earthquakes. So we talked about all of those. And then we talked about mental health, again, post COVID, mental stresses. We just talked about the children and their exposure to a new life, to a new age, right? To bullying in schools. Now we have cyberbullying, so that we have anxiety, obesity, and autism, right? Some of the, I mean, you have many, but these are three of the main factors affecting children in homes, right? Then in a lot of crime has been related to houses or homes that have single parents, unemployed parents or parent, right, where children are forced to go out and beg, or children are forced to go out and not go to school. They are not being properly schooled in the public schools, so that they lime outside. They have peer pressure, then they begin to join groups and gangs, and this is what is happening right now in our country. This whole culture, right? The economy, or because of we have illegal drugs and the ability to sell, it might be easier for a young person, right, to sell marijuana, cocaine, and then some of the newer drugs right now, like ecstasy and some of the other drugs that are now coming on the streets, and make about $3,000 or $4,000 in 1 hour, than to go and work, right, in a home to cut someone's grass, or to clean the property, or maintain, or to paint, or to even do any one of the janitorial, or even other trades like mechanics, or mechanic, laborers, carpentry, electricians, and so we have a problem now where some of these persons who could become employable in some of these areas are now going into easy money, and therefore the Venezuelans who also come now and work cheaper are taking away those jobs from Trinidadians who might want to do it. So again, those are some of the hazards that are affecting. So hazards. So we said risk is equal to hazards, right? And the frequency of the hazards, for example, flooding is a high frequency. Although you might think it's not as when you compare the impact that an earthquake will do to a city, a village, a house, or a home, right? The severity is not as bad. So we say it's a high frequency, low severity impact, and an earthquake is a low frequency, high severity impact, right? So although an earthquake might come once in a long time, when it does come, it does do more destruction to lives, limbs, and livelihoods and property, right, than a flood will do, because you are more able to deal and prepare for a flood than you are for an earthquake. So this is why we always have to think about the earthquake there. The tsunamis, most of the persons who are on the coastal areas would have that as a risk when you're doing those community risk assessments, compared to a community that might be more in the central part of Trinidad and Tobago. The problem with that is that how we are very so close to the South American continent, most of our tsunamis will actually affect communities from the east north, right, where you have the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, up to about approximately about midway into the country, except in the north, where the northern range will protect us in the on the leeward side. But of course, most of the communities on the windward side, like Maracas and Toco, they will be destroyed by a tsunami. So these are some of the things that when you're doing the community assessments, right? When you assess the risks, you would have to understand these are some of the things you would have to advise in terms of policy changes. Again, a policy change would be when we talked about tsunamis, is if you go to Maracas Beach and you see the setup there, you will find that you have bacon shark sheds on the beach. If you go to Miami Beach, South Beach, Cocoa Beach, Nice in France, the Riviera, Atlantic City, you would see that what you have is a beach, then you have a boardwalk sometimes, then you have the road, and then you have the business places on the other side of the road, right? You don't have the business places on the beach. Now, if you have surges, and we have had coastal surges that have come right up onto those sheds and destroyed some of the seatings, and right up into there, and flooded up the entire property. So some of these things will have to change, and I think that based on when you do your community assessment, you use the community tool, and you have the engineers that go up there with the team. You have the the services officers that goes up with the team. You have the police officers will be looking also at some of the information that we'll be getting firstly on the ground, and then when is shared with the database is shared with the police, they can begin now to look at the persons who are unemployed, who are not going to school, so that we can start now. Of course, the Venezuelans would have to be registered in that as well, because most of them are renting. They don't really sleep under a tree. They are renting in little homes. In fact, quite a lot of persons are renting the Venezuelans their rooms, and they're making quite a lot of money on that. Again, probably the tax people would also probably get information from that, because quite a lot of revenue is obtained from rental and it's not been declared. So these are some of the things that will come out of that database, right? Once you have that, which is again is going to take you at least 3 to 6 months to begin to continue to assess our population, we will have a very good idea of where everyone is. That's what the housing census is. And even if we have at least about 80 to 90% accuracy, right, of where these homes are with the coordinates, we have the geographical coordinates. We can actually, with current AI, we can actually have a very good GI geographical information, GIS spatial understanding of where these properties are. See, before what we had was we had the maps. We can get the maps from the Ministry of Planning and Development. You can email them, and they will send you the municipal maps. They will send you the EDs, and they will tell you where the houses are in terms of the housing census. But it's just a table. But now with the new technologies, we'll be able to get a real time video, or at least a photograph, right, or image, right, of where these homes are on the map, and they will be able to have their geographical coordinates, and we'll be able to have the information. And once you overlay the GIS maps on each other with the information and data, you can actually just put your cursor on any one of the homes, and then you will come up with Stephen Ramroop, his wife Joanna Ramroop, right, 3 children, blah blah blah, 2 in Canada, 1 in Trinidad, etc., etc., etc. 4 persons in the dwelling, right, single parent, unemployed, 3 persons, 1 teenager not at home, right? When you go back 3 weeks after, not at home, 4 weeks after, not at home. So it means that you have to be very careful with that teenager. He's missing in action, right? He's not at school, because when we call the school, right, he's not at school. So he's not at school, he's not at home. So where is he? And these are some of the things that the police would need to know, because these are where you're going to start breeding your criminals, right? When you look at the Venezuelans, they're not at work, they're not at school, so that the government will have to now implement programs to begin to school some of these Venezuelans. Because if you don't put them in school, and you don't account for them, right, during a certain period of time, and you don't educate them and provide them with some degree of employment later on, we have all the trades. Remember, I said we have a shortage of persons to clean homes, maintenance, right, roof maintenance, right, cleaning of drains, laborers. We have welders. I mean, there are quite a lot of janitorial and trade workers, right? Mechanics. We need quite a lot of persons, and many countries of the world, that's a problem. If you go to any country of the world, Canada, there's a very very big demand for skilled laborers, nurses, all of these uh, uh, schooling. And if you have persons, the social services now will have to start, based on the information, start going back into the communities and saying, look, this is a single mother, she has no employment. Either the government can provide some degree of employment for this parent, whether it's a man or a woman, and find out how many children are in that. And if the children cannot survive, and the food that they're getting, and the mother has to beg, and all of these things, then those children have to be placed in government institutions, right, for the safety of the children, right, until the parent or the parents can show that they can get some reliable income for the children to come back into that home. And if, for example, there are certain children who have no parents, then they have to be placed in government supported foster homes, right? So that that type of highly developed social work and social services need to be implemented in Trinidad. We do not have a very highly institutionalized program for homeless children or persons who do not have parents, or they have single parents who are unemployed and can't take care of them, so that they can go to temporary government supported institutions or even government private sector, cooperation, right? In other words, then the PPP arrangements with a lot of private sector organizations, humanitarian organizations, can begin to get contracted by the government with some subsidies, so that we can begin schooling some of the Venezuelan children, as well as any homes that we find with single parents who are unemployed, or the level of employment of financial remuneration at the end of the month is not enough. All of these are triggers for crime. They are statistically significant when it comes to dealing with crime, and it also, again, in the short term, medium term, and long term, will reduce crime, because we have to be thinking not just of the short term but also the medium and long term, right? um, I mean, I have spoken for about an hour. I think that am I correct? Yes, about an hour. So I don't know if Gary, or I don't know if Sumant is here, so I don't know if you.
Suman is here. Suman, you have a question? You want to go ahead? I didn't want to interrupt you because I wanted you
No,
to get this session
yeah,
going. Go ahead,
Doc was,
Suman.
we were all listening as students in class.
Well, okay, because I mean, I didn't finish as yet. It's just that I found I was talking long, and when you have no
No, no,
feedback,
no.
it's
I
you know,
thoroughly agreed. And what I would like to add is that one of two things.
yeah,
Firstly, that these things have to be backed up by legislation.
correct,
And
yeah,
without legislation, we could talk as much as we want.
yeah,
Nobody knows who hugs that data, whether
yes,
it's CSO, whether it's the Ministry of Planning, who that information is not shared, so that it brings the next question.
yeah,
That information system, the sharing of
yeah,
information among various ministries.
yeah. So
And then thirdly,
yeah,
you need to have the human capacity now to analyze and make sense of all this data, because we get so much data just that housing census
yes,
that if you don't pull out the insights and observations and use it as a planning mechanism now
yeah,
among all the ministries, and let them coordinate with one another so there is no overlap and so on, from security, national security, I mean homeland security, to education, to social services and so on. On top of that, you know, as people become eligible for their old age pension, you know long ahead of time
yeah, yes,
how many people in this area and so on. And if you want to be people centered, or you want to bring people centered governance
yeah,
in their manifesto, that they preach that, then you can deliver these services to the people,
all right,
you know,
yeah.
at short notice. Don't let them go to run around and you can't get a birth certificate here, and it's a total nonsense.
Yeah, so and this is exactly what the community toolkit does, and it's from that. Now we have so many things that have been stated in the manifesto that will be easier.
Correct.
We talked about the stroke center, for example, right? We have persons, and we indicated that when you say stroke center, it shouldn't just be an institutionalized building, a building that you put stroke patients in, but the whole stroke care system, where persons can actually be allowed to take their parents home and be taught to treat them at home in their own environment before they pass. And this is where the Ministry of Housing, right, in a lot of the South American nations, in fact, in Central and South America, over 34% of their budget is put towards retrofitting homes, especially for the elderly. In other words, and what is happening is that we have a more elderly situation, population now, as we are realizing from our NIS, where they probably would not be able to pay up after 60. They will probably have to raise it to 65 because they just don't have the money. So now that we're having people living older, longer, and and look at what is happening to Tobago Hospital. You cannot house all of these people in hospitals. So you have strokes, you'll have to initially save their lives, but then you have to send them somewhere, right? And if you have a step down facility, this is where the government and a private sector relationship can occur. Then you keep them there for a while, you get their limbs moving and whatever, and then you send them into your reconstructed or so retrofitted homes. So you have ramps, you have beds that are elevated, etc. Right? You have washrooms that are properly created to bathe them, and straps and pulleys, etc., to lift them up in the bed instead of causing the wife or the husband to have low back pain and all this sort of thing before they die, right? You have straps. Then you have the home visiting program where you have nurse district health visitors and other nurses. And now we talk about a lot of unemployed doctors, for example. So we can have a lot of doctors who can actually visit some of these homes. Since you already have that census, you already did the vulnerability capacity assessment. You know the homes where you have the stroke patients, the disabled patients, the patients who have autism, etc., etc., etc. So you can already put that onto your health database, your public health database, your public safety database, your housing database for retrofitting. So you have your programs, which is people-centered. So you begin now to tackle the problems of health on an individual dwelling or household basis. You cut down on the admissions to hospitals. You cut down on the amount of money spent on healthcare within the secondary and tertiary institutions. And you pump up the amount of money spent on preventative healthcare at the home level, which means it is all the science which you're supposed to do. And you will find that you end up saving millions and billions of dollars in healthcare over the 5 years or 10 years that you are in governance. So these are some of the things that will come out by actually doing this community-based toolkit, right? Rollout in all the communities, right? What I was going to finally talk about is that how do you manage this entire program? And it's based on basically seven criteria. One, you have to have a strategy, an overall country strategy, right? That actually a business plan that tells you how you're going to roll out, which are the relevant ministries that are going to be working, what about the training budgets that are required to train the census takers and the social workers, etc., into specific whatever, the entire programming, right? The budgetary, the strategy for your AI introduction and the tools that you're going to be using, etc., etc. The second one of the criteria that we have to look at in terms of the programming is leadership. In other words, then who leads this? Obviously, it's going to be a combination of Ministry of Planning and Development, right, leading it in such a way that the other ministries like social services and community development, local government, national security, Ministry of Health, etc., they all play a part, right? But the leadership, right, the strategy, two very most important components of the entire program of the community-based assessments for resilience building, the culture of resilience building, right? Ministry of Housing, as I told you, is a very important part of that in terms of the retrofitting of homes, so that you cater now for the other aspects of the manifesto, the manifestos, which you already stated, things like stroke management. Again, you look at your location. We talked about ambulance systems. We talked about times. Dr. Maraz spoke about the time it takes to respond in terms of certain areas, whether you need satellite police posts in certain areas because of locations, right? Whether or not these high-risk areas, you have drug moving in because they are porous borders, etc., etc. So all of these, in each one of the villages, in each one of the areas, the geographical areas of the enumeration district, this information is picked up. The third criteria is what we call the business process, the process of actually executing these first of all, the philosophy, the vision of what you're going to be doing, the rollout, the implementation part. So the whole process, right? The training of persons in facilitating in how to retrieve answers rather than forcing answers. This is a skill that has to be done. It's not something that you just send somebody who just come out of high school or university graduate and tell them go and take these interviews. It's a specific way in which these are done. The questionnaires themselves, right? The data, the fields, right? The use of the IT to convert the app and send the information back to a central clearinghouse for data, etc. The analysis of data. So there's a whole business process that has to go into this program. The other thing is the whole question of information, measurement, and knowledge management. Right, this is what we talked about. Right, how do we assimilate the data? How we put other pertinent demographic data that we'll obtain, from example, from the interview, such as persons who don't have birth papers, persons who don't have IDs, people who don't have employment, etc. Right. All of those information and the knowledge management, basically, that the knowledge that you'll be sharing, the introduction of engagement metrics, so that once you begin to get into the household, you have to find the methodology of following up, for example, on an autistic child, on obesity, etc. So all of these will now have to go into separate databases for, like, for example, what about the obesity program we have in the government? What are the autistic programs we have both in the private and public sector, right? So that whole networking, right, that whole measurement, right, and development of KPIs for each one of the parameters. We talked about, how infrastructure, we talked about social services, sorry, so we talked about mental health, we talked about environment and ecology, we talked about health, we talked about public safety, that is the disasters, etc. One of the things that I didn't talk about is spiritual, spiritual, right, resilience. Spiritual resilience is not really a religious thing. It is the ability of the household. What it is a factor that is not a quantitative measure, but it has been shown to be very important in resilience. And it was shown in the Christchurch earthquake, right, where persons who had belief systems, whether it be religious or otherwise, they were more able to survive a disaster. Again, the same thing with Japan, right, where you looked at a lot of their heritage sites that were protected, and they spent a lot of money in protecting the heritage sites, right? Do we spend money here in our country in terms of protecting our heritage areas or heritage sites? And these are some of the things that take a country's social fabric and elevate it to a certain level, because you have a spiritual sense of being, rather than, I'm not talking about religion, don't get me wrong, but it's a different criteria in terms of how we measure resilience, right? So when we look at the information, right, we look at measurement and we look at knowledge management. The next criteria is what we call the development of the actual staff, or the team that we are sending out to do these community assessments. This is not something that you do as one. It's not something as a one-off. It's something it has to be a continuous program of re-education, redevelopment. So it is almost that a team has to be created, right, that supports this whole project. It's not just a housing census that you're doing. You're doing a community-based culture of resilience assessment. So you're building a culture of resilience. And to build a culture is not a one-off thing. It's a whole program. So you have to develop the staff that are going to do it. You have to make it a legacy, so that long after this exercise is over, you don't want a government to come and take power again in 2030, right? And then change the whole system or stop it. So this is what Samantha was talking about. You now have to understand that a lot of this has to be developed like a legacy program. And to support legacy, you come back to strategy where you have to have legislation. So you have to make sure that to make something institutionalized, you'll have to introduce legislation as one of the key criteria to institutionalize something. So if another government comes, they can't just stop it. They have to go back, and stop legislation. They can sabotage the program, but because you institutionalize it, it will continue. It will have to continue, because in order for the key information and for the outputs to happen, you have to be able to continue it. The other thing, right, is what we call customer focus or people-centered focus. So everything here from that I've been talking about seems like it's a top-down, right, one-way situation. But we haven't mentioned too much about the individual themselves in the interview, the home persons, and what are some of their contributions to the whole process. So in doing that, we have to understand things about the gender, disability, mental capacity, right? Financial capacity, microfinance, right? The ability of the persons to sustain themselves, their spirituality, right? Their whole individual outlook on the community, their fears, their anxieties, all of those things are part of the whole program, and that has to be embedded in how engagement. And one of the things, one of the things clearly is communication, the ability to have communication tools, both informal and formal communication, right? Teaching the person's ability to connect with your local government institutions and your other stakeholders, your key stakeholders like the Red Crosses and the NGOs, faith-based organizations, CBOs, right? So that whole that whole people-centered focus is what you're talking about, Mr. Singh, Suman.
Yes.
The other criteria is results. What you have to measure your gains. You have to know all your successes and your challenges. You have to make sure that not just doing the thing, you're going to have to develop the key indicators that tell you whether you're getting somewhere or not. Because the only way that you can understand what is happening going forward is measure it. You have to, the whole program has to have KPIs, and they must be reported, and they must be measured going forward, and you must be able to use that to guide what you need to do, right, going forward. Understand? So I'm finished in terms of basically.
Yeah, the last point, Doc, is perhaps to me is the most important thing, because we could not wait even at the end of a year to measure. We can do this incrementally every
Yes, yeah,
semi-annually, quarterly, so you can, you can see in your gap analysis whether you're hitting the mark, whether you're going to meet your target at the end of the year, long before you can know that. So that is important, that we do have the monitoring and evaluation of the each aspect which you outlined,
yeah,
and all the metrics you're going to measure, the KPIs, and all that ties into the manifesto, the strategic goals identified by the current government. I mean, from an let's say from a developmental point of view, your work becomes so much easier when you can identify your pain points, so to speak. And once you can identify your pain points, you can take the correct measures to make sure it doesn't escalate into something more, demanding later on. And it's like nipping the problem on the body. I think it's like preventative medication, or preventative healthcare.
yeah,
So this is the scenario, and you quite laid it out nicely. But our ministers, our technocrats, our advisors, our senior officials need to be au courant with these types of projects to implement it. And this is the thing, we may talk about it all the time, but if nobody is going to implement these things, and you really don't want to implement it in a scattershot method, because you will get scattershot results. It
correct.
has to be something holistic, integrated, and all ministries should play their part, because it redounds to making their work, the individual ministries' work, more competent.
Yeah,
And that this is what I'm saying. But if we don't have or get that buy-in from the planners, or like Ministry of Planning should be one of the core players in this thing.
yeah,
And if they don't get buy-in and let them, enforce or play that supervisory role to ensure that education pulls their weight, agriculture pulls their weight, social services pull their weight, homeland security pull their weight, and so on. You can't do it in bits and pieces. You need to have this coordination among them, and they have to realize now the benefits we're going to derive from having this CBA. In this case, it's community-based assessment. To me, CV is cost-benefit analysis, but it's yeah, but got the gist what you're saying. But our technocrats have to understand this concept and work towards it, because if you don't do this thing, then your delivery on your promises and your mandate to deliver services over the next 5 years become thwarted. And
Yeah.
this is my take. Very nice, very good. You have identified. We know that these are the successes and what are the pain points. We have addressed them going forward, but you need to have that core skill set of personnel to take it forward and do the analytical part, as well as you need. Most of these can be a lot of them are low-hanging fruits. You can implement it in a community setting.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
You don't have to go, no high-tech, nothing much, no. Only when you get the data and so on, and you can disaggregate it and do your workflows and see who's going to access this data and who get the privileges, first level and second level, higher tiers and so on. Then more of the technology comes into play at that point in time. But initially, let's say for the first year or two, there's a lot of simple groundwork needs to be done to establish, to get the data. And in getting the data now, you can plan much better. Again, it will make your delivery of your promises so much easier at that time. Once we can legislate for these things as well, to make sure it has teeth going forward and no government coming in kind of scrap that program and do like the same old like it always has been before. We can never move forward. You can only move sideways.
Yeah.
After the next 5 years, the country has not progressed one bit. It's always sideways. And this is we should always take example from some of the countries that implement this. South Korea and Singapore especially. That doesn't matter if government changes. They don't care. The policies, the good policies have to be carried out and measured. And the assessment is made by the population at the end of your term. And say, okay, when UNC was there, they did 45% of this thing, and you were here now, paying them, you did 10%. So the population now forms their own judgment. Unless you have this legislation aspect of it going, that will stymie any sort of progress with the planning perspective, because you have to do things with teeth. You can't just go nilly-dilly and say, oh, we collected information and then corporate CSO hugging that information for the next 2 years and blah, blah, blah. It has to be shared. And the sharing of that information is really crucial if you're going to develop or come near to development, status. And a lot of things you have mentioned, especially from the health perspective. I went through this for the past year. I had lumbar surgery, lumbar fusion, my L4 and L5. It was done by robotic. Mount Sinai here was the only hospital that had the robot that did this surgery for me. And, I did it. Next 2 days, I came out back. The very next day, I had nurses come into my home. He had to check on me, do my physiotherapy, make sure I can stand and stretch and everything. Your pain levels were measured. And this is the thing: you take the hospitalization out of the hospital, so to speak, and you get that care now at your home. And that's a big plus. You don't have to get up and get dressed and have someone take you to the hospital, and they say, you don't clog the system up and leave the hospital for the
Yeah.
real hospitalizations.
Yeah, and this is where a lot of things can be done for the elderly, right? Things like getting your, your ID cards sorted out, your birth paper, your driver's permit renewed. So hopefully, I mean, the Ministry of Transport can start working on some of these things where you don't have to go and stand up all day to meet an officer in the licensing office. Some of these things could be done online. Some of these things could be done using
Uh,
some
Ye-
customer service representatives at the home of the persons. So I mean,
Yeah.
even the local centers, you can have buses coming around in certain communities like they were doing before. you know
Yes, they were doing that. Ministry of Public Admin and
yeah,
iGov TT.
yeah.
They were doing that.
And my brother was the CEO there for a while, Selvan Ramru.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I had liaised with them a lot when I
Yeah,
did the laptop project and so on. So yeah, that they had these buses going out to the communities and so on. And this is exactly what they're bringing governance to the people, man. That's what it's all about. Especially the disadvantaged, the elderly people and so on. Make sure they can get their dialysis at home, their visits by the doctors. There's so many things which are low-hanging fruits which we can do in the short term to help alleviate the pains that people are undergoing.
yeah. So this is the basis. I think if you want to go people centered, it's going to have to start with knowing where your people are, not just the UNC people or the PNM people, but where your people are,
Yeah,
and
the
where
community. Yeah,
and where
correct.
your missing people are, and when you find out your missing people, that is where you're going to get your crime, and that is where you're going to be able now to know who is doing the crime because you know who is who. This is what I'm trying to say. If you have 1.4 million people when you do your census and you're getting 1.3 million, then something is wrong because if you go into a house and there are four people and you're only getting two, and you do that in the whole country in all the EDs, and you find that you have about 100,000 people unaccounted for, then they are your criminals. They are the ones who are going to be living in the bushes. They are the ones who are going to be, in dilapidated homes, having a little, panchayats, working and sleeping in the day and working in the night. So this is where the Ministry of Local Government would have to enforce some of the existing legislation under the Public Nuisance Act, for example. You can give people notice, people who have properties that are not being cleaned with old dilapidated buildings or whatever it is. And if it is not cleaned or whatever after the notice, the government has the ability under the law to go and clean that, remove those buildings, etc., and clean those properties because a lot of those places are breeding places for criminal activities. Because if they're not living in residences, they are staying somewhere else, and we have to find it out. You have the military can be used to go into the bushes, and they have scans and drones that could be used to go out into the forested areas and all this sort of thing. So if you're missing people from your census, it means that they are there somewhere, right? Either they're out of the country, you know what I mean? So you have to find them or at least locate them, because out of your criminal elements, those are a lot of them are going to come from there.
Yes.
And then if you once you build the Venezuelan persons registry, I mean, I'm not putting this in a bad way, but you have to log every single one of them, right? Because the point about it is that is a population that is a high risk population for the country as you go forward. You have to either you bring them in and you regularize them, right? Or whoever has to go home could go home. The point about it is that you have to have a clear policy on what you're doing with this 100,000 to 200,000 people. About only 30 40,000 are legal. The other ones, either you make them legal, but the point is once you do that, you absorb them into society, so you account for them. Because if you don't start accounting for them in the next even now, it's happening right now. They are Venezuelan gangs.
I think the sensible thing is to absorb the people, document everybody.
And I think so. There's it is a better thing to do. And I mean, the point about it is that once you do that, now you can account for it and you can start preventing or mitigating some of the. Well, listen, what is the biggest problem we have as a society right now? It's crime. I mean, the thing about it is that this is what we really, this is what we fear most. I mean, when my son goes to work in the morning, right? I sometimes I cringe because they right in San Fernando they ran down one of our businessman's daughter and they hit the back of the car. And luckily, because she was sensible enough to drive to the police station, she they shot at the vehicle. I mean. I don't know for what reason, but I mean, she was sensible. And then about a month after, they killed the son. Well, I mean, the son's driver, or the guy who was supposed to be killed was the son, and unfortunately, one of the workers was in the vehicle. Right, they had switched the vehicle with the son of the brother of the same girl, and they killed the boy who switched the vehicle because they thought it was the son. So you see, obviously they're targeting that businessman for whatever reason, but the point is they're doing it in broad daylight. You see, so when that is happening with guns, with shooting, where we go Friday evening to dine, you know what I mean? We go with our little grandchild in that restaurant, and they're shooting bullets and killing people right outside the restaurant. Then you begin to worry, right?
Well, a stray bullet, you can get hit with a stray bullet.
Yeah,
And, people talking about granting FUL to law abiding citizens, and we'll get a Wild West situation. So, what do we have right now? We have a Beirut situation, but they are ranting because they know that the fact that the people who they are attacking will be able to defend themselves. That is where the problem is.
yeah,
And so we have to lock down things, and the community resilience thing, structure can be built into a way that we include the security of the community, not just with disaster and all the other things, but an all-inclusive plan of action. And this is where Ministry of Local Government, Community Development, planning, of course, has to be part of it, but and then education and health and everybody else that fall in. But these three, planning, community, and local government, has to be factored in here at the initial stages, and then you include the other ministries as you develop a plan of action. How you go about it. The Ministry of National Security, definitely, because the response has to be done through Ministry of National Security, where they delegate the police to participate. And so it has to be a built-out structure. That's the way I see it. This is all my common sense thinking. I am no specialist. This is just my common sense recommendation, in that we go this route, and the sooner we get it going is the better for all of us, because it'll be more feasible.
Correct.
yep.
So, gentlemen, if you have anything else to add, else we can close up and continue the discussion on another phase.
Yeah.
Of things.
The-
We could probably go into NOC the next time you come around. Um,
Any, anything in the news today, Gary? Heard anything?
for us, the New York side, what do you mean?
No news. The news back home.
Oh, well, I don't want to spoil the program tonight. We're going to deal with Marvin Gonzalez, and all the racist rant and instigation
all
he's
right.
trying to do. We're going to deal with another night. I want to keep this program strictly on community resilience right now.
Sound makes
And
sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
and we go deal with that on another program. Maybe tomorrow night, if you guys have some time.
Yeah, sure. That'd be nice.
Uh,
Yeah.
all right, guys. So thank you
Guys,
very much,
take care.
Dr. Rambrup.
You're
I
welcome.
want to maybe do another session with you on health and CPR and all these different things, and the
Oh
ENT
yeah,
thing. I
that'd be
want
fun. That
so
that's my
so
that, that, that
organize your ENT session, when, and let me know when.
that's a skill based thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
So
definitely.
all right.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank
Okay.
you everyone for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow night.
Okay.
Take care. Have a
Take
good
care.
one.
Take care, guys.